Somewhere over the cold, grey waters of the Norwegian Sea, two Russian aircraft kept circling back toward Britain's newest and most expensive warship, again and again, dropping listening devices into the water beneath it. On July the 2nd, 2026, the Royal Air Force scrambled F-35 stealth fighters, launched directly from the deck of HMS Prince of Wales itself, to intercept and drive off two Russian Tu-142 Bear F maritime patrol aircraft that had been repeatedly approaching Britain's £3 billion aircraft carrier. The UK Ministry of Defence didn't mince words about what it thought of the encounter, calling it unsafe and unprofessional. No shots were fired, no missiles were launched. But what happened over those waters represents exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-tension military signaling that's become an almost routine feature of the standoff between NATO and Russia. Today, we're breaking down exactly what these Russian aircraft were doing, why sonobuoys, small underwater listening devices, are such a significant detail in this story, why Britain's response mattered as a demonstration of a brand new NATO capability, and how this single incident fits into a much longer escalating pattern of Russian aircraft probing NATO's northern defenses. Stay to the end, because this specific carrier and this specific stretch of ocean are becoming the new front line of a confrontation most people aren't watching closely enough. Let's start with exactly what happened, because the specific details here matter enormously for understanding why this incident drew such a sharp response from British officials. According to the UK Ministry of Defence, two Russian Tu-142 aircraft, NATO reporting name Bear F, repeatedly flew close to a UK-led carrier strike group in the Norwegian Sea. This wasn't a single flyover or a distant radar contact. The word repeatedly is doing real work in that official description, indicating the Russian aircraft made multiple passes near the carrier group rather than a single brief encounter. During those repeated approaches, the Russian aircraft reportedly dropped numerous sonobuoys, small, expendable underwater listening devices specifically designed to detect submarines, near HMS Prince of Wales itself. The response came quickly. On July the 2nd, British F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters launched directly from the carrier's own flight deck, intercepted the Russian aircraft, and escorted them away from the task group, preventing them from continuing to operate unchecked around one of NATO's most valuable naval assets. Let's talk about why this specific ship matters so much, because HMS Prince of Wales isn't just any vessel. It's the Royal Navy's flagship, a £3 billion aircraft carrier, and according to reporting, the first European aircraft carrier to conduct NATO air defense operations using F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters. That's a genuinely significant milestone in European military capability. A European-operated carrier providing NATO air defense coverage using the most advanced fighter jet in the alliance's arsenal. When Russian aircraft repeatedly approach a vessel with that kind of symbolic and strategic weight, dropping submarine-hunting sonobuoys in the process, it's not simply routine reconnaissance. It reads as a direct test of exactly how NATO's newest and most capable carrier-based air defense system actually responds under real-world pressure. Now let's dig into that sonobuoy detail specifically, because it tells you a lot about what the Russian aircraft were actually trying to accomplish out there. A Tu-142. Bear F is fundamentally a maritime patrol and anti-submarine warfare aircraft, and sonobuoys are the specific tool it uses to hunt submarines, small devices dropped into the water that listen for the acoustic signature of vessels moving beneath the surface. According to reporting, the repeated approaches and the deployment of these sonobuoys near the carrier group suggest a fairly specific goal, an attempt to gather intelligence on NATO submarine activity and carrier operations in that specific stretch of ocean. In other words, this wasn't simply a Russian aircraft passing through international airspace to make a point. It was actively, functionally attempting to collect real intelligence on what NATO naval assets, including potentially any submarines escorting the carrier group, were doing in the area, using exactly the sensor package the aircraft was built to deploy for that purpose. Let's be precise about where this actually happened, because getting the geography right matters for understanding the legal and diplomatic dimensions of this story. This encounter took place in the Norwegian Sea, in international waters and international airspace, not inside UK or Norwegian sovereign territory. That's an important distinction. Russian long-range patrol aircraft operating in international airspace, even when flying close to a NATO naval task group, are not technically violating anyone's sovereign borders by doing so. What made this specific encounter serious enough to draw an official Ministry of Defense statement wasn't a territorial violation. It was the manner of the approach itself, repeated, close passes near a carrier group, which UK officials specifically characterized as unsafe and unprofessional, language that signals a judgment about how the Russian aircraft were flown and positioned relative to NATO assets, not simply where they were flying. Let's talk about why Britain chose to respond the way it did, launching F-35s directly from the carrier itself, rather than scrambling shore-based Typhoons the way the RAF typically handles most Russian aircraft encounters near the UK mainland. This detail is genuinely significant from a capability standpoint. HMS Prince of Wales, being able to generate its own combat air patrol on demand, intercepting and escorting away Russian aircraft without needing to wait for land-based fighters to arrive from Scotland or elsewhere, demonstrates a level of independent carrier strike group capability that Britain has been working to rebuild for years, following the retirement of its previous generation of carriers and carrier-based fighters. This specific response, F-35s launching from the carrier's own deck to intercept the Bear F aircraft, functioned as a real-world demonstration that this newly rebuilt capability actually works as intended under genuine operational pressure, not just in training exercises. Let's think through why no shots were fired and why the detail matters just as much as the interception itself. According to reporting, the encounter, despite officials calling it unsafe and unprofessional, never escalated to actual weapons fire on either side. That's consistent with how nearly every documented Russia-NATO aerial encounter throughout this broader period of tension has played out. Russian aircraft probe, approach, and gather intelligence. NATO aircraft intercept, identify, and escort them away. Neither side actually fires on the other. That pattern reflects a specific, carefully managed form of military signaling, both sides demonstrating capability and resolve without crossing the threshold into direct, deadly confrontation. As one analysis of the incident put it, the encounter illustrates how the confrontation between NATO and Russia increasingly plays out through aggressive military signaling rather than direct conflict, a description that captures precisely what's happening in these repeated, tense, but ultimately non-violent encounters across contested airspace and waters throughout the High North and the Baltic region. Let's zoom out and place this specific incident into the much broader pattern of Russian aircraft activity near NATO territory throughout 2026, because this wasn't an isolated event. Just months earlier, on April 14, 2026, the RAF scrambled 2 Typhoon fighters from RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland after radar detected what was assessed as a possible Russian long-range bomber approaching the Shetland sector in the North Sea. According to reporting from The Telegraph, the Russian contact remained outside the 12 nautical mile limit that defines UK sovereign airspace throughout the entire encounter, and no visual interception phase was even required before the mission concluded. That's worth noting specifically because it reinforces an important pattern across nearly every documented incident this year. Russian aircraft consistently approach the edges of NATO's area of interest, close enough to trigger a quick reaction alert scramble, but they do not actually cross into anyone's sovereign airspace. That distinction is genuinely important for accurate reporting on these encounters, since it would be easy, given how dramatic these scrambles sound, to assume Russian aircraft are routinely violating NATO airspace outright. The confirmed pattern across this year's incidents shows something more precise, persistent, close approaches to the boundary of NATO's monitored airspace, without an actual confirmed sovereign airspace incursion. There's an even more serious incident worth including here, because it shows this broader pattern of Russian military aircraft activity escalating well beyond simple approach and monitor encounters. Back in April 2026, and confirmed by the UK Defence Ministry in a statement released May 20th, 2 Russian jets repeatedly and dangerously intercepted a British Royal Air Force Rivet Joint surveillance aircraft over the Black Sea. According to the ministry's own account, this was the most serious encounter involving a UK Rivet Joint since 2022, when a Russian aircraft had fired a missile near a British plane over that same region. In this more recent incident, one Russian Su-35 flew close enough to the British aircraft to actually trigger its emergency systems, including disabling the Rivet Joint's autopilot. In a separate dangerous intercept during the same encounter, a Russian Su-27 conducted 6 passes directly in front of the British aircraft. UK Defence Secretary John Healey addressed the incident directly, stating it would not deter the UK's commitment to defend NATO, its allies, and its interests from Russian aggression. That Black Sea Rivet Joint incident represents a meaningfully more aggressive category of encounter than the carrier shadowing incident in the Norwegian Sea, involving direct, close proximity maneuvering specifically designed to disrupt and endanger a British aircraft's own onboard systems rather than simply monitoring or intelligence gathering from a distance. Let's also look at how this pattern has played out specifically for RAF units deployed to NATO's eastern flank, because the frequency of these encounters has been genuinely intense at times. According to a Royal Air Force statement, Typhoon jets based at Malbork, Poland, were scrambled 4 separate times in just 7 days to intercept Russian aircraft, either leaving Kaliningrad's airspace or transiting close to NATO's monitored airspace in that region. 3 of those 4 scrambles involved a Russian Ilyushin Il-20M, known by its NATO reporting name Kut-A, a communications and electronic signals, intelligence aircraft, essentially a dedicated spy plane built specifically for intercepting and analyzing electronic transmissions. The 4th scramble that same week involved a pair of Russian Su-35 Flanker H fighters. An RAF spokesperson explained the reasoning behind these repeated interceptions plainly, noting that the aircraft involved were not communicating and had not filed a flight plan, which is required under international law, meaning the interceptions serve a real practical air safety function beyond their obvious military signaling purpose, protecting civilian air traffic operating in the same congested airspace from an aircraft that isn't following standard international communication protocols. Let's talk about the broader strategic significance of why the High North specifically, the region covering the Norwegian Sea, the Arctic, and the waters north of Scotland, has become such an active theater for these encounters. According to reporting, this region is rapidly becoming one of the most volatile theaters in Europe's new era of great power competition. With Finland and Sweden having joined NATO in recent years, strengthening the alliance's northern flank considerably, Russia now faces a dramatically altered security landscape along its northwestern border compared to just a few years ago. The Norwegian Sea specifically has become a vital corridor for NATO naval operations, while the broader Arctic region is increasingly viewed as critical for missile defense, submarine patrols, and the protection of undersea infrastructure, including the critical undersea cables carrying much of the world's internet and communications traffic. Britain's deployment of HMS Prince of Wales into these waters is specifically designed to demonstrate that NATO can project real naval power deep into northern Europe, protect vital sea lanes, and reinforce allies bordering Russia directly. Moscow's response, repeatedly sending Bear-F aircraft to shadow and monitor that exact carrier group, suggests Russia is determined to show that no NATO deployment into this region will go unchallenged or unmonitored. Let's also address something worth being upfront about, because accurate reporting means acknowledging complications in a story even when they don't fit neatly into a single dramatic narrative. Reporting on the same period noted that HMS Prince of Wales had also required repairs during its deployment to Norway, temporarily delaying parts of its broader mission. Technical issues during lengthy naval deployments aren't unusual for any modern navy, but the timing inevitably attracted additional scrutiny given the carrier's central symbolic role in Britain's broader defense strategy and its position at the heart of this specific encounter with Russian aircraft. That detail doesn't undermine the significance of the sonobuoy incident or the F-35 interception, but it's a useful reminder that even NATO's most advanced naval assets operate with the same kind of real-world maintenance challenges facing any long-deployed warship, adding a layer of operational complexity to Britain's broader demonstration of capability in these contested northern waters. Let's think about what these Russian long-range patrol flights represent in a longer historical context, because this isn't a new Russian tactic invented specifically for this current period of heightened tension. Russia has long used long-range patrol aircraft like the Tu-142 to monitor NATO naval deployments, particularly across strategically sensitive waters stretching from the North Atlantic through to the Arctic Ocean. This kind of aerial reconnaissance and shadowing has been a persistent feature of Russia-NATO military relations for decades, tracing back through the Cold War and continuing, with varying intensity, through the years since. What's changed more recently isn't the existence of these flights, but their frequency, their assertiveness, and the specific assets they're now being deployed against, including Britain's newest and most capable carrier, operating with its own independent F-35 strike capability for the first time. Let's talk through what this pattern of encounters actually risks, beyond the immediate drama of any single scramble or interception. According to reporting, none of these individual incidents alone amount to war. Russian aircraft probing NATO defenses, British and Allied fighters scrambling to intercept, naval task groups operating under constant surveillance, none of these single events, taken in isolation, represents a direct act of war between Russia and NATO. But collectively, this pattern reveals something else worth taking seriously: a sustained, persistent level of military pressure that carries an inherent, ongoing risk of miscalculation. Every single one of these encounters, whether it's a Bear-F dropping sonobuoys near a carrier, a Su-35 flying close enough to disable a rivet joint's autopilot, or an unidentified aircraft approaching the Shetland sector, represents a moment where a small navigational error, a misread signal, or an unexpected maneuver by either side could escalate into something considerably more serious than a monitored, professionally managed intercept. That's precisely the risk military analysts point to when they talk about this kind of sustained, low-intensity confrontation. Not that any single encounter is likely to spark a war on its own, but that repeating this pattern often enough, across enough different theaters, eventually increases the odds that one of these encounters goes wrong in a way nobody actually intended. Let's be clear about what remains uncertain or unconfirmed in this specific story, because that matters for keeping this account accurate rather than overstated. We don't have independent confirmation of exactly what intelligence, if any, the Russian aircraft actually gathered using the sonobuoys they dropped near HMS Prince of Wales. We don't know whether this was a one-time planned probing mission, specifically targeting the carrier group's presence in the Norwegian Sea, or part of a more routine, ongoing Russian surveillance pattern in that region that simply happened to draw this level of public attention because of the carrier's high profile. And we don't know whether this specific incident will factor into any broader diplomatic response from the UK government beyond the Ministry of Defence's public statement characterizing the encounter as unsafe and unprofessional. Those are exactly the kinds of details that tend to remain classified or simply unconfirmed following this type of military encounter, since neither side typically has much incentive to fully disclose the specifics of what intelligence was or wasn't successfully gathered during these kinds of shadowing operations. Let's think about what to watch for going forward, because this specific encounter is very unlikely to be the last of its kind involving HMS Prince of Wales or any other NATO carrier operating in these northern waters. Given the pattern established throughout 2026, repeated typhoon scrambles near Kaliningrad, the dangerous Black Sea Rivet Joint intercept, the Shetland sector bomber approach, and now this carrier shadowing incident in the Norwegian Sea, it's reasonable to expect further encounters as NATO continues expanding its naval presence and air policing operations across this broader region. The key things worth watching are whether future encounters continue following this same relatively controlled pattern of approach and intercept without weapons fire, or whether incidents like the Black Sea autopilot disabling encounter become more frequent, suggesting a genuine escalation in how aggressively Russian pilots are willing to maneuver near NATO aircraft and ships. It's also worth watching whether Britain's demonstrated ability to launch F-35s directly from HMS Prince of Wales to handle these encounters becomes a more standard part of how the carrier operates during future deployments, or whether this specific response was a one-time, high-profile demonstration tied to this particular incident's circumstances. Before wrapping up, it's worth being direct about where every detail in this video comes from, and about correcting one important framing issue up front. Despite headlines that sometimes use dramatic language like Russian aircraft crossing into NATO airspace, every single documented incident referenced in this video, from the carrier shadowing encounter in the Norwegian Sea to the Shetland sector bomber approach to the repeated Kaliningrad area scrambles in Poland, was officially confirmed by UK and NATO sources to have occurred in international airspace or international waters, without the Russian aircraft actually entering anyone's sovereign airspace. The Ministry of Defence's own account of the HMS Prince of Wales incident, reported by London Loves Business, describes the Russian aircraft repeatedly approaching the carrier group in the Norwegian Sea, not entering UK or Norwegian sovereign airspace directly. Similarly, the RAF's own statement on the April 2026 Shetland incident, reported by Army Recognition and IB Times UK, explicitly confirmed the Russian contact remained outside the 12 nautical mile UK sovereign airspace limit throughout. The more serious Black Sea Rivet Joint intercept, confirmed by the UK Defence Ministry and reported by CBS News and Al Jazeera, similarly took place in international airspace over international waters, involving dangerous maneuvering rather than a sovereign airspace violation. Getting this distinction right matters, because conflating close aggressive shadowing in international airspace with an actual sovereign airspace incursion overstates what's been officially confirmed, even though the underlying incidents themselves are serious and well documented on their own terms. It's also worth adding a bit more context on the broader capability significance of Britain even having F-35s aboard HMS Prince of Wales in the first place, because this ties directly into years of UK defence policy debate. Britain's F-35B fleet, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant specifically designed for carrier operations, has been a long-term investment tied directly to the Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, of which HMS Prince of Wales is the second vessel. For years, questions persisted in UK defence circles about whether Britain would ever field enough F-35s and train enough carrier-qualified pilots to make its carrier strike group genuinely operationally independent, rather than relying heavily on Allied, particularly American aircraft, to supplement its own carrier air wing during major deployments. This specific incident, British F-35s launching from the carrier's own deck to independently handle a real Russian probing encounter without needing to call in outside support, represents exactly the kind of real-world validation that answers those long-standing capability questions, at least for this specific type of encounter. Whether that same independent capability holds up against a more serious, sustained challenge remains, naturally, an open question that hasn't yet been tested in the way this Norwegian Sea encounter tested it. There's one final piece of institutional context worth adding, because it helps explain why these encounters happen with such structured, predictable regularity, rather than as chaotic, unplanned crises each time. NATO operates a standing framework known as enhanced air policing, a rotating deployment of Allied fighter jets stationed across the alliance's Baltic and eastern flank, specifically to monitor and respond to exactly this kind of unidentified or non-communicating Russian aircraft activity. The RAF's 4 scrambles in 7 days from Malbork, Poland, mentioned earlier in this video, were conducted specifically as part of that broader NATO enhanced air policing mission, with British personnel deployed there, operating under the codename Operation Chessman. That institutional framework is precisely why these responses happen as quickly and smoothly as they generally do. dedicated quick reaction alert crews sitting on standby around the clock specifically so that when a radar contact like an unidentified Russian bomber near Shetland or an aircraft leaving Kaliningrad without a flight plan appears, Allied jets can be airborne within minutes rather than facing a slow, improvised scramble. The HMS Prince of Wales incident represents a related but distinct capability, a carrier group generating its own organic air defense response rather than relying on the shore-based air policing network. But both systems reflect the same underlying reality. NATO has built extensive standing infrastructure specifically because these Russian probing flights have become frequent and predictable enough to require permanent rather than improvised response capability. Let's go back to where we started. Over the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea, two Russian Tu-142 Bear F aircraft kept circling back toward Britain's flagship carrier, dropping sonobuoys into the water beneath it, again and again, in what the UK Ministry of Defence bluntly called an unsafe and unprofessional encounter. Britain's response came from the carrier itself, F-35 stealth fighters launching directly off its deck, intercepting and escorting the Russian aircraft away without a single shot fired. No sovereign airspace was violated, no missiles were exchanged. But the message on both sides was unmistakable. Russia wanted to know exactly what NATO's newest carrier could do and where it was operating. And Britain wanted Moscow to know that its answer would be immediate, effective, and entirely capable of handling the challenge without needing to escalate any further. As NATO's northern flank continues to harden, with Finland and Sweden now inside the alliance, and Britain's carrier strike group pushing deeper into contested Arctic waters, encounters like this one aren't likely to become rarer. They're likely to become the new normal. Thank you for watching. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what happened out there and why it matters, make sure to like the video and drop a comment letting us know what stood out most, whether it's the sonobuoys dropped near the carrier, the F-35s launching directly off the flight deck, or the far more dangerous Black Sea incident that disabled a British aircraft's autopilot entirely. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking how these encounters between NATO and Russia continue evolving across the High North, the Baltic, and the Black Sea, because based on the pattern we've walked through today, this almost certainly won't be the last scramble you hear about this year.